To give you a description of the situation I was in, I have to give you a description of me. I am 18 years old and I am gay. I've never had an actual boyfriend and I've only come out recently. And having social anxiety, I have few close friends and I use online forum or chat sites to talk to people. This happened around the time frame of August-September 2015 and I was just beginning my senior year. I had just broken up with this guy who I'd been talking to, and I was open to talking to anyone. You could say that I am a little naive and that this mostly comes from being really shy. Anyways, I had come across this app called Meet Me and decided that I'd give it another try. I'd had the app before but deleted it out of lack of interest, as most of the guys on there were mostly pervs or, for lack of a better word, weird. But I wanted to download it again, as being the naive 17-year-old I was at the time, I thought that this was a good choice. The first week of having the app went without a problem, and I made a few friends on there, nothing romantic. That is, until he messaged me. It was a Saturday night and I noticed that I had a new admirer on there. I wasn't really alarmed with it because I've talked to plenty of guys and girls from the site. But this guy was different. Something about his picture screamed creepy. He definitely wasn't in my age group and had to be in his late 30s or 40s. He was tall and had rugged curly blonde hair and had a smile that would make you think of a sex offender or town creep. He was also from the UK. Even though my eyes had judged him, I am generally a nice person. So I decided to message him out of general kindness. That was the biggest mistake ever. The conversation started with a simple hello on my end and an innocent friendly "How are you tonight?" 5 minutes later, I got a response. "You're cute." Immediately, I was alarmed because 1. I was 17 and he was definitely older than me, and 2. He couldn't have missed this as my age was on my profile, and he still decided to message me that. Not a hello, not a "I'm good, how about yourself?" Just a simple but weird "You're cute." I should have blocked him then and there, but like a dumbass, I let my niceness get the best of me. I replied in the nicest way possible. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested, but thank you." About 10 minutes later, I got a message back saying, "Come on, you're super hot and I want to get to know you more." At this point, I was thinking that this guy was a creep and didn't reply, hoping he'd eventually stop messaging me and move on to another unfortunate guy. I was wrong. Throughout the night, the texts got weirder and weirder. Messages like, "Do you like BDSM? I'd love to tie this guy up. Babe, why don't you answer me? I'm here, all for you." The creepiness finally reached its peak when the fucking sicko was asking me to send him pictures of my neck. He also started asking me to Skype him so he could watch me sleep and masturbate to me. At this point, I was upset and creeped out at the messages that he had sent to me, so I finally did the right thing and blocked him. I didn't sleep that night, and the thought of him watching me was bone-chilling. Fast forward to a couple of weeks later. I was at a friend's house and I was bored. I have insomnia and I'm mostly up at nighttime watching some of my favorite YouTubers if I can't sleep. But tonight, I decided to get on Meet Me to check my admirers since I hadn't checked it in quite some time. And to my misfortune, I had a friend request from the same guy, except this time, he made a new account with a different profile picture. In this one, he was shirtless and had an evil smirk on his face. He started messaging me with, "Babe, where did you go? Why did you block me?" Things of that nature. I should have blocked him, but at this point I became brave and sick of his messages. I pretended to be my boyfriend and messaged him. "Hey, this is his boyfriend. If you message him again, we'll have problems." This pissed him off, but shockingly, he complied and blocked me. But not before sending me a creepy last message. 4 words that have been burned into my brain. His last words to me were, "I am watching you." Clearly, I was terrified and upset, as anyone in my situation would be. But at the same time, I was thanking God that he lived in a completely different country, in a completely different continent. However, like the last time, I did not sleep that night, and for weeks after that, I had night terrors of this guy watching me. Eventually though, I forgot him and he had become a repressed memory. That is, until now. Fast forward to a month ago, I was scrolling through my Facebook while with a friend of mine at a restaurant, and I came across this news story that startled me. The article read, "Trial of alleged grinder serial killer delayed." This article was posted in January of 2016, and being in America, I didn't really catch up on the UK news. I wasn't that alarmed until I saw a picture of the guy. The same fucking guy who was messaging me creepy obscene messages turned out to be a serial killer who preyed on gay men. According to the article, this sick bastard would lure gay men using a gay hookup app called Grindr, take them to his house, poison and strangle them, and then dump their bodies around East London. This same guy, the same exact guy who had sent me creepy, downright horrendous messages, had committed such awful and heinous crimes. I haven't told many people about this as I don't want people to worry about me. I haven't even told my father, who I tell everything as he's super overprotective of me. I know you may be asking, why are you so worried? He lives across the world. And while this is true, the simple thought of coming across someone like this, let alone a serial killer, who, had I been dumb enough and just so happened to live in East London, would have possibly been one of his many victims. I'm at ease now and comfortable enough to come out and talk about this, as he's in custody and is still across the world, and has zero way of contacting me, and probably doesn't even remember me. And honestly, I'd like to keep it that way.
Number 3.
This was about 10 years ago. I was around 12 or 13 at the time. I grew up in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada, where there really wasn't anything to do during the summer holidays. To defeat the summer boredom, my father and I would take 2 weeks every summer and rent a cabin up north. Our favourite place to go was a small tourist island called Minatula Island, which was a 6-hour drive north from our hometown, and then a 2-hour ferry ride across the lake to the island. While on the ferry, an older gentleman in a semi-formal suit and pant was handing out a small stack of papers in the tourist section of the boat. My father and I approached him and took one of his flyers. It was a map of the island, crudely designed in MS Paint or an equivalent free drawing program. On the map was various tourist attractions and picnic areas. We thanked the man, excited to travel the entirety of the island, which was the original plan, and went on our way. Upon returning to the tourist room a half-hour later, the man was no longer there. We had just assumed he had run out of amateur maps when we finally got to the island and we were exhausted. It took an additional hour and a half to get to our cabin, which was located about 15 feet from the shore of a beautiful rock-bottom lake. We spent the majority of the 2 weeks traveling from one end of the island to the other, hitting every tourist attraction and small tackle shop we ran into. On the final 3 days of our trip, we had run out of places to go, and then my father remembered the map. At the very bottom right corner of the map, which was also the lowest, most accessible tip of the island, was a long dotted line that indicated an extensive dirt road. At the end of the road was a picnic area. We thought, why not? It's right by the lake, it might be very beautiful. We packed our bags and loaded them into the old 1988 Ford Mustang ragtop. This car had been pushed to its absolute limits this trip, and was having more difficulty starting with each passing day. The oil had run significantly thin a couple of times during the trip due to the extreme summer heat and use, but the car was still moving and my father, being a mechanic himself, thought nothing of it. The oil pressures always resumed their normal viscosity after the car had rested a few hours. we got out our old school paper map and plotted our route. The drive was beautiful, open fields and mighty emerald forests. That was until we started to reach civilization, if you could call it that. The houses that came into view were quite disheveled in each town we passed through, and while in one of the native towns we witnessed an entire town of Native Americans covered in red and black war paint, they stared at us as we drove past. But again, we thought nothing of it. Probably just a ceremony or celebration that we had unknowingly disrupted. Hell, I'd be angry too. Finally, we made it to the final turn that would take us down the elusive dirt road, the last one we had yet to discover. At this point, we had been driving for about 2 hours and the heat had made the car's oil pressure gradually drop. But we were too close to our destination to turn back now. As we drove down this road, we noticed the rundown and mostly boarded up houses became more scarce. The distance between them grew larger until finally there were no more houses to be seen. The road turned slowly from asphalt to cracked grey stone to loose gravel, then to dirt. The road became so narrow that only a single car could fit on it at a time, and we hoped no one on a four-wheeler would come around the bend like a bat out of hell, not expecting visitors. I would also like to mention that telephone poles stopped at the gravel road. Whatever was back here had no electricity supplied to them by the town. The further we went, the more uneasy we became. We saw old abandoned logging equipment in behind broken and mangled trees. The sun became blotted out by the thick foliage overhead. We continued to drive, making jokes about the hills have eyes and wrong turn and other horrible situations of the sort. Finally, we reached a clearing. Beside the now driveway that was once the road we were on, we saw what could only be described as a massive burning stake that looked like something they used to burn witches in Salem. This thing was massive, at least 15 feet high and with a 10-foot platform halfway up. It was built out of twine, logs, twigs and straw. In the middle of the platform was a massive log that stuck up from the middle and stood probably another 8 feet high. Seriously, look up burning at the stake and that is what this thing looked like. A little further down the driveway was an old 2-story house. It reminded me of a plantation mansion, not because of the size but the design. Almost all of the windows were shattered and an old door hung off a single hinge at the entrance. A mere 10 feet from the house was a cliff that dropped off straight into the rocky lake below. My father and I thought we had missed a turn, but there was absolutely no way to go but straight. My stomach dropped when I looked past the old creepy house. Beside a white van that looked like it had rolled through a ditch was a picnic table. A single wooden picnic table, right beside these people's house. My father and I exchanged nervous glances when all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dust cloud. There was a beat-up red pickup truck racing toward our parked car. He had come from behind the house and he had hit his foot to the floor. My father panicked. He threw the Mustang in reverse and spun around so fast I almost vomited. He shifted into drive and tore away, but something made his eyes widen. The car was beeping at him. The oil pressure was dangerously low. He swore as he gunned it. The car made a small cry of anguish before ripping up the dirt and bits of gravel as we tore out of there like our lives depended on it. Who knows, maybe they did. We soared down that dirt road, taking risky turns, catching air when we hit huge holes in the earth. All of the while, the car screaming at him, begging him to stop. But he didn't. He never slowed down. He never looked back. We finally arrived at the paved part of the road and my father looked behind us. No one was following us. He slowed down slightly, but I knew he was still well over the speed limit. Once we cleared the areas that advertised their shitty housing, we pulled into the first garage we saw. The car nearly stalled right then and there. The last 2 days, we just stayed in our cabin, trying to recount what had happened and also unable to really do anything because the car repair had used up the rest of our spending money. The day we left the island was the last time we spoke about the incident. We did, however, look for the man giving out the maps on the ferry ride home. He wasn't there. We asked a couple of locals that were going to the mainland for shopping, and no one had ever heard about this so-called picnic area that we had visited. In fact, when we showed them the map that we were given, no one could recognize the area past the small towns that were before it, but warned us that the inhabitants of those towns weren't always the kindest to strangers. I think that picnic area is a trap to get curious people to drive down there so they can be killed and barbecued on their shrine. Or maybe just robbed. Who knows? So, for any of you planning on visiting the island, I hope I don't deter you. It is a beautiful and peaceful place, and the locals are friendly and kind and trustworthy. But if you ever see a kind older gentleman in semi-formal suit and pant, take his map and smile sweetly. Some of the locations are truly majestic, but never, and I mean never, go to the picnic area at the bottom point of the island.
Number 2.
I remember very clearly the day I almost died. I was a freshman at Oklahoma State with a few months of summer left before classes began. My friends, John and Jane, and I were avid hikers and decided to take one final summer trip. Our destination was an area that we were very familiar with, having hiked there 6 or 7 times before. It was a few hours away from our hometown, and we were, as always, very excited to get away. Being typical guys, John and I had only packed a bag each, while Jane had several. We met at John's place around 6 a.m. that morning and took off in his Jeep. I recall being so excited, having no idea that my life would soon change forever. We arrived at the park around 9 a.m. and began our journey up the first hill. Being August, the temperature was already in the mid-90s, and it was looking like a long day before we were to reach the first mountain peak. There were several other hikers and campers before we reached the guts of the park. This means that we were so far into the forest that civilization disappeared. Around 1 o'clock, we stopped for a water break. All 3 of us were very happy and chatting about the scenery when we heard it, the cock of a shotgun. This is a very distinct sound that John and I noticed right away. We stood to our feet and looked in all directions for the culprit, but saw nothing. I remember John and I looking at each other in a what the fuck kind of way. There were no firearms of any kind allowed in this area of the park. We yelled out, hello? Who's there? Several times, but never got an answer. After discussing the situation and going from freaking ourselves out to playing it off as a broken tree limb that had fallen, we decided to keep on our way. I was thrown off the whole rest of the hike that day, as were John and Jane. What had happened was sketchy, but we were too far to turn back now. Darkness crept in around 9 o'clock and we were putting the finishing touches on our camp. We already had a roaring fire and 3 small tents for each of us. We ate our packed dinners and talked amongst the fire. We talked about funny shit and serious shit as the 3 of us usually did. I remember Jane was in the middle of speaking about her upcoming classes when we heard another startling sound. Twigs and leaves being stepped on, clearly by human feet, roughly 20 yards into the darkness. Again, this brought all of us to our feet. We knew that it was not coincidental that 2 strange, humanistic sounds happened in our area within the park so large. We were definitely being followed. The steps stopped as we stood in silence. Keep in mind, we had no suitable weapons to defend ourselves if needed, and absolutely no cell phone service. Jane, surprisingly, was the first to react. She yelled out, "Whoever it is following us, I'm letting you know that we have a gun." Jane was lying, of course, but John and I were impressed with her quick thinking. Just as the adrenaline began to fall, a scuffed, gravelly laugh came from the trees. It was a sarcastic laugh, and low. We could barely hear it, but it was clearly a laugh. It was more of a snickering, really, and it faded as the footsteps walked out of hearing distance. We were shocked, stunned, scared shitless, however you want to say it. We knew that we were in trouble. A feeling of being trapped overcame me, and I'm sure John and Jane as well. It was pitch black and there was just no way that we were hiking back. We threw suggestions at each other and discussed our options. Jane was sobbing and shaking at this point. She was and still is a tough gal, so it was hard to watch at the time. We eventually all settled into one tent with our pocket knives drawn to our side. Earlier, when I said that these tents were small, I mean that they were small. Maybe 5 feet in width and 7 in length, so we were crammed to say the least. It was hot and sticky and overly uncomfortable, but we felt much safer. Looking back, it's kind of embarrassing to show how scared we were, especially 2 decently sized 19-year-olds. But trust me, when you're in a pitch black forest in the middle of nowhere being stalked by an unknown shotgun-carrying man, anyone would be frightened. After several hours of laying sleepless, the situation became lighter. We began to slowly joke and poke fun at the situation, mimicking Jane's previous holler and gun threat into the woods. We wondered out loud how long she'd been a badass for and asked if she would be our personal bodyguard from there on out. We were exhausted from being so mentally distressed. It must have been around 1 a.m. when we finally began to fall asleep. I was the last awake, but was drifting quickly when I heard more rustling of the leaves. I knew John and Jane were asleep by their heavy breathing and his snoring. I didn't want to wake them and start the whole process over, so I just laid there in silence and listened. The footsteps were slow and soft, but were getting closer. Before I knew it, they were nearly right outside the tent. I jabbed John in the leg with a balled fist 3 times before he woke up. He was startled and loudly said, "Damn, what?" This set into motion a series of blurred events. All in one motion, Jane shot up in response to John and began freaking out while the footsteps outside darted for our tent. A tearing sound in the tent slid right along my side as I rotated my body away from the attacker. In the chaos, I shouted, "John, get the gun! Shoot this guy!" As soon as I said those words, the footsteps sprinted back into the forest and we nearly ran over each other, exiting the tent. To sum things up, the man dragged the hunting knife through our tent, dropping it before running off. We ran through the darkness the rest of the night and into the early morning until we were able to locate a cell phone signal to call for the police. That day, we had to guide the sheriff's office back to the scene to retrieve our things and give them the location. That's when they discovered the knife. We spent the entire day in the police station and gave our statements. We were so close to death, and I think about that every day. I don't know what that man wanted, or why he didn't just shoot us with the gun that we knew he had, but I'm beyond happy to have escaped with my life that night, and thank God that I made the false statement to John about the gun. I'm a senior now at a different school in Oklahoma, but still keep in touch with John and Jane. However, I haven't been able to bring myself to go hiking again, or anything secluded. This story was all over the local news, which I'm sure you could find with a little research. I would encourage anyone who wishes to hike to always have an appropriate weapon on hand. I'm thankful for my life every day, and writing about this experience was therapeutic. Safe travels, my friends.
Number 1.
I have had a lot of strange experiences in my house growing up, and I thought I would share a few. The house I grew up in was built in the 50s and was a model for the neighborhood that would eventually build up around it. My mother actually grew up in the house first, and eventually purchased it from my grandparents, which have kept the house in the family for almost 50 years and counting. I spent quite a bit of time alone in the house, growing up with a strong sense that I was never quite alone, but it never really bothered me. That is, unless I had to go downstairs. Without fail, that would change the feeling in the house entirely. It's always cold down there and foreboding. It caused a sense of dread when you had to go downstairs, and I get chills just thinking about it. The place had a family room with a TV and fireplace, along with a finished bathroom, computer room, bedroom, separate laundry room, and a large storage room. The storage room was the worst part of the basement, and hands down the place I liked the least. Its door, which was a sliding wooden door, much like the other rooms in the basement, was also directly next to the TV and always left a horrible uneasy feeling when I watched TV downstairs as a child. Anyway, going downstairs was always a bit of a process. I would slowly descend the stairs, peek around the wall into the family room to make sure the coast was clear, then bolt for the light switch. Going back upstairs, now that was even worse. Every single time I would have to switch the lights off, lest I get in trouble with my father and God forbid sent back down to turn them off, and bolt up the stairs like my ass was on fire and a bucket of water awaited at the top. I have never once ran up there without the sense that I'm being chased by something and losing the race. Growing up, I would hear noises and even voices downstairs. While home alone, I would hear people running upstairs, which would prompt me into thinking that someone had come home, only to find that I was still alone. I would be called downstairs from what sounded like my mother, only to discover that no one was there when I went down. It wasn't unusual for the lights to be off when peering downstairs, as my father was crazy about wasting power, and my mother would only use the ones she absolutely needed to, which would only include the ones inside the laundry room. Its door was under the stairs, meaning that I would never know if the call from my mother was legit or not until I would go downstairs, slide open its door and discover that the laundry room lights were off and that I was the only one home. Then shortly after, realizing that I was standing in my basement, alone, in the dark. This happened often and never got less scary when it did. For a period of time while this was all going on, I would have these dreams where I was downstairs doing what I always did in the basement, playing video games, watching TV, etc. But there would be a lady in a white dress of sorts, standing there, watching me. I would look to my right and she was there in the distance, standing still and arms down in front of her, watching. I would turn my head to the left and everything was just as it should be. Sometimes I would look all around me just to see if she would still be there, but turn again to find her sitting next to me, body straight but head and stare fixed right on me. That is when I would immediately burst up awake, drenched in sweat. The unused spare bedroom downstairs also had a walk-in closet housing old military uniforms and other jackets and clothing that were preserved in plastic covers. Sometimes, as a child, friends and I would play hide-and-go-seek down there, and that would be my favorite hiding spot, since one could remain hidden among the clothes even when someone was actively looking right in your direction. The clothes made a very distinctive sound when touched or moved, and nothing else in the house sounded like it. As I got older and the weird basement activities began to intensify, I would often hear that noise before making my mad dash upstairs. The light switch for the family room is right outside the doorway to the bedroom, and when I would reach it to go upstairs, I would hear that rustling as if something was emerging from the closet. Seeing that I had a view of the open doorway into the pitch-black room from the light switch, this caused me to have to flip and bolt up the stairs for dear life, even quicker than normal. Like I mentioned, the activity in the basement ramped up as I got older. My girlfriend, Lynn, and I would hang out downstairs constantly to avoid my parents. It was basically our own space, for better or worse. One day, we finished watching a movie and she went to use the bathroom. While she was in there, I had to check something on my computer, which was up in my bedroom. Without thinking, I ran upstairs to quickly check it out, then moments later came back downstairs. She was out of the bathroom and was looking at me with what she calls her skeptical eyes. I asked her what was up and she said, "Very funny." I was confused and asked what she was talking about. She explained that I had run up and down the stairs really quickly, then opened the storage room door and dragged something heavy out and in front of the bathroom door to scare her. I didn't know what to say. I tried to tell her that I just ran upstairs to check my computer and that I hadn't been downstairs at all, but she didn't believe me. Luckily, I had typed a few messages on AIM while upstairs and was able to show her the chat log times, which proved my point, but then at the same time, freaked her out. She also realized that she never heard whatever was dragged in front of the door actually being dragged back to where it came from, which scared her even further. This happened to her several more times over the period of a few weeks. I could go on and on, but I'll end with this final story. Though I have dozens of stories I could write about, this is the one that really sticks out in my mind as a major event. A few years later, Lynn and we were now married and we were asked to dog sit for my mother and father while they went on vacation. My parents had 2 Shih Tzus, which they gated off to remain in the kitchen. Lynn and I decided we would just stay over for a few days, as my parents' house was, in a way, a small vacation for us as well. One night, like the beginning of a cliché horror movie, it began vigorously storming outside. The dark house would completely illuminate from the bright lightning flashes, only to then shake from the tremendously loud thunder just seconds later. The 2 dogs loved thunderstorms and never barked or freaked out at them. If anything, it likely helped them to sleep, as I could never wake them to use the bathroom if one of them was in the area. Around midnight, as my wife and I laid in bed with the TV and lights off so we could go to sleep, I thought I heard footsteps on the stairs, but chalked it up to the storm. Shortly after, I heard the sliding door at the top of the stairs, which I had locked and could only be locked from the inside, slide open, and the dogs suddenly started going crazy. I had never heard them bark like this in my entire life. I throw off my covers and told Lynn I'm going to go check on them. That's when we heard it. Above the sound of the rain and their barking, we both suddenly hear a woman who sounds exactly like my mother speaking to them. I couldn't quite make out exactly what was being said, but I could tell it was in a very familiar, consoling tone that my mother would do if they were scared about something. I wondered for a moment if my parents had actually come home early, but quickly realized that I would have been notified, seen the car pull up, or heck, heard both back doors open, and then of course a struggle with the one-way lock on the sliding door. Not only that, but the dogs would have been thrilled to see them, which was an entirely different bark. This was terror. They snarled, yelped, and vigorously barked over and over, while the familiar voice of my mother was still speaking. I told Lynn I had to investigate in case it was an intruder, but deep down we both knew what we were dealing with. I crept out of bed, my sounds masked by the chaos happening both outside and inside the house. The door to the room led to the hallway, which was shaped like an L, and exiting the room would put you at the bottom right of that shape. In other words, the end of the smaller line of an L-letter shape, if that makes sense. Against Lynn's pleading, I creep out the door and go into the hallway. The walls leading from the bend in the hall to the room are lined with full-body mirrors, which nearly gave me a heart attack when lightning suddenly illuminated the hallway, revealing my reflection standing directly next to me. Needless to say, we both looked shocked to be there. I regrouped, shot Lynn the "you didn't see that" look, and got back to task. I peered my head around the corner and saw both dogs with their backs pressed up against the gate, both looking up at something that was just behind the wall to the right and out of sight. I stood there, wondering what to do. Part of me wanted to just lock myself in the room with Lynn, and the other half wanted to just say, "fuck it," and just rush into the kitchen and deal with whatever I would find. I had spent my life rushing upstairs away from unseen fears in my house, and frankly, I wasn't a kid anymore, and I was tired of this shit. I glanced at Lynn again, then decided that I was going in. I bolted towards the kitchen at full speed. I reached the gate in time to see both dogs instantly stop barking, the voice stop, and both their heads just turn and look at me. I whipped the upper half of my body over the gate to peer into the kitchen, only to see it empty. I glanced down at them, and they are both suddenly calm, but sitting in puddles of their own pee. Accidents of that nature never happened, so that was further confirmation to me that something was definitely wrong. I hop over the gate and walk to the sliding door at the opposite end of the kitchen, which was now unlocked and opened. The back door was still locked from the inside and closed like I left it. But despite it being 80 degrees outside and summer, the area in front of the back door was absolutely freezing. I glanced downstairs and it was beyond pitch black and didn't seem to illuminate like the rest of the house did from the flashes of lightning. I had enough adrenaline at this point to just bolt downstairs into the darkness and confront my childhood tormentor head on, and oddly enough, I was damn tempted to do so. Rational thought kicked in, however, and I closed the sliding door and tended to the dogs, spending the next hour or so giving them a bath and cleaning the floor. Lynn donned her "you're a fucking idiot for doing that" eyes, but I actually felt good about it. I'm over that bitch and her tricks. Several weeks later, when my parents' vacation was over, I was visiting their house and found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, which is right across from the sliding door to the basement stairs. I decided to sit down and tell her what had happened that night while we were watching the dogs. I mentioned the stairs and the strange woman's voice, and she went completely pale and froze. She explained that as a child, she would hear a voice that sounded very close to her aunt, which would trick her into coming down into the basement, though it would always be dark and empty. This was interesting, but I must note that her aunt was and is still alive to this day. She too was scared to go into the basement as a child because of this, and shared the sense of being chased up the stairs even to this day. She also said, even recently, that while sitting alone at the table, she would sometimes hear someone stomp up the stairs at an inhumane speed, stop at the sliding door, but never open it. The dogs hear it as well, and they are not fans of this. So far, to this day, I don't quite know what roams the house and why it does it. I just know it's a woman, or that he can make itself sound like one. It's apparently a bit on the shy side when it comes to actually being seen, but I'm honestly okay with that. I now take my sweet time going up the stairs, though I still get the sensation that I should be running for my life.